Vasanta, if I may request that I should not be receiving this admit option, because it's disturbing very much. Is that possible that you don't make me host?
Yes, ma'am, I'll do that.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to one more session of Wednesdays for Water. Today, we are going to talk about climate change-induced water distress. On behalf of the entire Wednesdays for Water team, we would like to really welcome all of you, particularly our regular participants who have been encouraging us and supporting us in these endeavors. And today we also complete actually 50 weeks of Wednesdays for Water, and we have already networked with over 100 speakers so far. And we are very excited about going ahead with it, with many more sessions to come, and especially speakers lined up at least until June and early July now. So we are not going anywhere. We are here with you all, talking about water, walking with you on water endeavors, and really learning the nuances of water. And for example, today we are going to talk about both climate change, water distress, touch upon various aspects of it, including gender and some regional aspects pertaining to it. So today we have two great speakers. I can say that them as my mentors, but really seeing them from distance and learning about their work. Sucharita Sen, professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and then Anamika Barua, also professor at IIT Guwahati. And they have actually spent their whole life talking about water, distress, gender, and many aspects around it. So I'm going to briefly do their bio speaking, but most of it will be put in the chat box, so we save time. We also have a young discussant today from AIT Bangkok, Devesh Belvese. He is from Nepal, so he is going to bring his also wisdom from both the countries, and then he is also ready to ask tough questions to Sucharita and Anamika. So as I mentioned, Sucharita is from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and she is going to be our second speaker. And our first speaker is Anamika Barua from IIT Guwahati. And she is, Anamika is a professor at ecological economics there. And she is also teaching at AIT Bangkok as visiting faculty. And this is how we also pulled Devesh into this conversation today. So it's also good to go outside India and really look at what things are there. So, I mean, as I mentioned, both the speakers have really worked beyond water also to many aspects around it. To the least, the gender lens, which we will see today, to the details, but then we will start with talking from, climate change aspects of it, right from how it is looked at a global goal and how it is locally manifested or understood. So with these lines, I would like to first invite Anamika to enlighten us and throw some difficult questions also to us so that we start thinking about these things. Later on, I will also introduce Sucharita when I'm going to invite her to speak. So over to you, Anamika, with a very simple question, which is usually our a kind of a style in Wednesdays for Water, I must say. The simple question itself is that how do you really start looking at these global agendas or policies or which are actually drawn from local impacts or local learnings, and how do they come back into the local system and try to change things the way they are? So thank you again to come and talk to us. Anamika, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mansi, but I am just trying to share my screen.
Sure, I will stop here.
Yeah. Just a second. Okay, so thank you very much, Mansi, for such a nice and a generous introduction. Yes, water has been an area of my work for quite some time. And yes, at multiple levels. Starting from local to transboundary, but at every level, I think the challenges are different and it's all interconnected. So of course, if you are talking about transboundary, you cannot really ignore the local challenges. And if you're talking about local challenges, you cannot ignore what is happening at the transboundary level because water does not follow any administrative boundary. So given that, what I plan to talk today is the topic, which is the title of the presentation, but I would like to actually take a very broader perspective and kind of introduce our audience more about some of the very important discussions or concepts that are around this whole climate change induced water distress. As many of us already know, that just very recently we have we just got the 6th assessment report of IPCC, and all the 3 working group reports are out now. So that's where I would like to focus on mostly. But before I do so, let me first introduce you to this slide, which is basically very, I think most of you know about this river island in Assam, which is called Majuli. And I had visited Majuli several times, but in 2013, I visited as a researcher. And one of the very interesting things that I came across when I spoke to the people is that so much of investments and so much of questions are raised around the floods that they always receive. But when you really speak to a local farmer, what he basically told me is that for them, flood is something welcoming, and it's basically like dancing with the water. The problem happens when it doesn't go back. The thing is, it's not that the flood coming in is an issue. The problem is that when it stays longer than it needs to stay. And that is where it damages their lives, their property, their livelihood, everything. And this is which has been obviously been compounded because of the changing climate. So the point that I want to make here is that the climate, although when we talk about climate change, it looks as if it's a global issue, but the impacts are felt at a very, very local level. Even a simple farmer who doesn't probably understand these global models would also feel the impact. Now, given that background, I want to first come to this IPCC report. You might see a bit of a text in my presentation, but I would not read these out. But this is for the audience as a take home if they want to know more about what this report is talking about. Now, the first thing is we know that there are 3 working groups in IPCC. IPCC working group 1 is more in the physical science, which came out last year in 2021, just before the COP. And there it was, for the first time, this report was very, very clear, and with high confidence, it basically mentioned that the kind of change that we are seeing today, humans are responsible for it. And if you really look at the IPCC report, which was published earlier in 2014, doesn't really tells this with such a high confidence. So it very clearly indicates that science is clear, science is confident. What it is basically telling us needs to be taken very seriously. One of the most important thing is the consequence. And one of the consequences is that extreme weather events are going to intensify, and there is no going back. We have to face them. So there is no way that we can escape the blunt of these extreme events. So we all need to be prepared. And these reports, as we know, are prepared by almost 800 scientists, and it's a work of almost 6 years. And so this is what the first working group report told us. Then we had the second working group report, which focuses mostly on the impact, vulnerability, and adaptation. And this report is the one which I think we really have a lot to look at. And this report talks about 4 very important things. One is, of course, it also echoes what the working group first report spoke about, that there would be increase in frequency and intensity of climate and weather extremes. And it also very clearly highlights that the vulnerability of ecosystems and people, it varies. And that's a point which we really need to understand. When this question comes that why it is only the developing country which seems to be more vulnerable, is because of various factors, which does not only relate to the biophysical characteristics, it also relates to the socio-economic development, the kind of growth process we are following, inequity, marginalization, even the historical pattern of inequity. Everything plays a very important role in making a country, a region, a community, vulnerable. And the other important point here is that this report very clearly indicates the sustainable development goals, 17 sustainable development goals, which each country has to achieve by 2030. Climate change is going to pose a huge challenge. So therefore, this is also, so every developing country has an unfinished development agenda. Now, how do we ensure that our development paths are chosen in a way that it does not pose any question in the future? The other point here is the humanitarian crisis. This climate hazards, when it interacts with human, it also leads to a lot of humanitarian crisis, which I'm going to talk about. For example, climate migration. You have to leave your, place where you have lived forever to another place because you don't have enough resources to live with. Then there is, of course, region and people with considerable development constraint. The last point is about mostly how development and climate change itself is related. But that development doesn't mean that you will go for a kind of a development which would bring more climate impact. Now, what does this two report basically talks about, or what is the takeaway from this report for South Asia and India? Very clear. I think this is just to emphasize once more to the audience that one of the things is water stress. There would be an issue of water availability and water quality both. And when you have this stress, it also means that there would be challenges with regards to water, food, livelihood, and also energy. And all of these are very closely related to the economy. And if you look at the report, it also mentions that if we do not really act, there will be almost around 2% GDP loss for South Asia. So so if you think that business as usual is still better, actually business as usual is going to give us more loss compared to going for a green path, growth path. Climate-induced hazards, the report is clear, both at the urban and rural areas, floods and droughts are going to increase. And the report specifically speaks a lot about the cities. And there is also a challenge related to the kind of infrastructure we have. Our infrastructure that we build are not climate resilient infrastructure. So you see whenever there is a flood, it gets swept away. And then you have to rebuild those infrastructure. But the issue here is, the trade-off is if you go for a climate resilient infrastructure, probably you might need a little bit more investment, but it is long-term. On the other hand, if you go for infrastructure, which you're putting it up ad hoc, it might be cheaper, but you will be building it again and again. And that's the case what we see actually in the state where I come from, in Assam, that every time the roads gets washed away and you have to repair it again. There are also a lot of limits that is now going to be posed on our adaptation capacity. Now, we in South Asia has been more focused on adapting to climate change rather than mitigating. And one of the reasons is the historical reason that we haven't been emitting as much as the Western world has been. But there is a limit to adaptation because adaptation would become extremely expensive if we do not mitigate. So it would definitely test our limits to adaptation. Health and well-being. It will also, water quality is closely related to human health, and it will also affect well-being. It will also affect our, the labor time that we spend, because if we are not well, we cannot contribute to the economy, which will also have an impact on our economic growth. Displacement and climate migration, which is already there. And in one of the recent conferences, there were some figures that came out, and it very clearly shows that the kind of, climate migration that we see is not actually because of war. It is now mostly because of dearth of resources, and people are leaving their places because they don't have enough resources. Water conflict at multiple scale, be it local, be it national, or at the transboundary, because everybody would like to have most of that resource, which is now going to get scarce. And then gender-based violence, both physical and mental. It is all so closely connected to gender as well, because women and water, we all know, has a very close connection. And so whenever there would be water scarcity, there would be issues with water quality, it would be the women who needs to be the provider. And that's where all the gender-based violence starts as well. So these are some of the larger takeaways that you see in case of the report, the way it would be affecting South Asia, particularly India. I want to bring this framework very quickly because it's a framework which came actually in 2014, and in 2022 report also, if you look at, they haven't really changed the framework, but they have actually expanded it. One of the beauty of IPCC report this year is that it brings in not just physical or natural science, it brings it a lot of social science into it. And it very clearly indicates that when you are trying to understand how much your state, your country, your region is at risk, you do not only focus on the hazards and exposure, because hazards, it's all the kind of landslide that we are going to face, the floods, the droughts. Exposure is who all are exposed to it. But what is also most important is who is vulnerable to it. You and I may be exposed to flood, but we may not be so vulnerable as much somebody else is. So you need to really understand who is vulnerable to that exposure. that exposure itself could be divided into biophysical and socioeconomic. When you look at the biophysical part of it, it's mostly the topography, the geomorphology, where your state or your country is. But the socioeconomic is closely related to your development. The kind of nature of poverty, the access to resources, information, skills, all of these, your health, education, everything comes here when you look at the socioeconomic vulnerability. If you look at this, we did a work very recently to understand, vulnerability. We created a vulnerability index across India. And if you look at this map, the red section is the section which usually doesn't seem to be a very highly vulnerable region, because mostly we focus on the coastal region, the region where floods happen, sea level rise, etc. However, our report very clearly came out and say that while there are physical hazards, but the capacity to adapt in these areas are much higher compared to the kind of capacity people have in these other areas. So whenever there is floods or droughts, it will take more time for these people to actually come back to their original self where they were before the flood hits. So this was one of the interesting things that we saw. And the other slide that I want to bring in here is the unsustainable flow of water. This is something we call it as a virtual water flow within the country. The left side, if you see the map, it clearly shows water scarcity situation. And on the right, you see how water transfers. I'm not going to spend too much time into it, but what I'm trying to tell you here is that there are several ways of reducing water stress. It is not just always about having physical or structural interventions, but there are also other interventions such as, you cannot really physically, you have to transfer water from one region to another. You can also do this through trade, and you can also grow such crops in such areas where water is abundant compared to those areas where water is scarce. So these are some of the concepts that needs to be understood and should be a part of our policy making as well, which is very closely related to footprints, water footprints. Now, coming to the relationship between any kind of disaster, be it drought or be it floods, what you actually see here is, your development, kind of development you follow can also lead to crisis and disaster, but then you always have a scope to build back better. So once your crisis hits you, you have a phase called recovery. How do you want to recover? This is where I think this is the junction where we all are right now, where we basically now we need to take a decision. Are we going to go back and follow the same track which we were following, or we want to go to a track which is basically includes the climate adaptation and mitigation strategies in our development pathways. So these are like 4 ways of looking at it. One is disaster can set back development, meaning you are doing very well. All of a sudden there are floods, there are droughts, which will take away a lot of your resources and your development feels a setback. Then disasters can also provide you development opportunities, like how do you build it back better? Development on one hand can increase your vulnerability if the kind of development you are doing is that brings in a lot of inequity. On the other hand, you can also reduce your vulnerability if your development path chosen is right. So what I want to end by saying here is that for the developing countries, we have many challenges. For countries like India, climate change is increasing, occurrence of extreme events are going to happen. We definitely need to follow a green growth path to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. On the other hand, we also will be facing a lot of, so what is going to happen is you cannot escape the impact of climate change anymore. So this is going to be a part now, and you will be seeing a lot of people losing their livelihoods, a lot of pressure on the economy, but we still need to manage both. We have to ensure that our economy keeps growing, but at the same time, we are able to manage disasters as well. So do we need to follow 2 different paths? Absolutely no, because it has to be merged together, and which basically tells us that we have to find ways to mainstream our disaster management with climate change, both into our development, path, which means climate change, mitigations, adaptation, development, these are not different. It has to be brought in together under one umbrella. So I'm going to leave it here, Mansi, and we'll be very happy to respond to any question that comes up later. Thank you.
Thank you, Anamika. Good to get us the overview from IPCC report. Otherwise, it is so big that as common citizens, we will be always reluctant to get into it and understand the nuances of it. But few key takeaways, which probably Devesh summarize later. But for me, an important part which you really raised is the whole dynamics of climate mitigation to climate, adaptation, and then linking it with the development discourse we often have, and where do people stand there. And when we get into further details, we can also talk about where do women stand there. I mean, even from my own study, I find out there are not many women leaders who are even in the discussion board when all these things are made up. Although we also have our many good women leaders who are part of the climate change report, IPCC report for that matter. So I will just stop here to let Devesh the rest of the talking about your work and about other works. And I will take the opportunity to now introduce Sucharita Sen and invite her to her presentation and position on this whole matter of climate-induced water distress. So Sucharita is professor at Center for Study of Regional Development in School of Social Science at JNU, and her interest in specialization expands beyond natural resource and rural livelihoods. And as I was mentioning earlier, also her soft corner also lies even in applied research of gender and all. And I mean, she has been on both sides. I mean, doing practice on the ground. We also share, by the way, both Anamika, Sucharita, and myself, we also share an organization together between us. But we can talk about it later. But then knowing Sucharita being a hardcore practitioner to hardcore professor, and then also talking about not only youth, but also gender, I would like to invite you, Sucharita, and again, thank you again for taking out time from your busy schedule and really agreeing to talk about this matter, because unless and until we keep talking and shouting about all these issues, I think we are far away to handling it. So talking is important. Over to you, Sucharita. Very simple question for you, which Anamika already raised actually. How do local people really relate themselves? Because for them, it is everyday life. It is, their neighborhood and max to little bit outside neighborhood, where the flood is coming, where the water is not coming to their house. And then when the burden comes to the shoulder of the woman, how do you really see what does that mean to them? Over to you, Sucharita. Thank you so much. Sucharita, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. So actually, I don't think I'm going to, I mean, my talk will be probably a little divorced from the theme, but I can't say that it's irrelevant, because this has to be put in the context of the water governance and who are being governed. So this is really voice of the people, from where, so I look at, so this is a part of, this is the second part, a small second part of a two-part project while I was in Saki Waters, and Anamika was a part of the first part. And I was primarily doing the second part at the same time. And they were related in the sense that the first talked about, transboundary governance. And the second part was about people who are being governed. So within that, it was really realized that women's voices are never heard, but the project took a slightly different slant, in the sense that we actually ended up doing a genderscape of Brahmaputra River. So it really, the idea was to understand. I don't think there was any understanding, and there was a similar work like this. So it's slightly off from the topic. So it is not really climate change. The climate change comes as a backdrop here, because flood, you can't alienate flood with Brahmaputra. So in that sense, but really doesn't talk about climate change. It's just provides a context. So, so this is based on actually a large team's effort for a long time. I myself was personally in the field for 21 days and kind of traversed from Bhutan to Lower Assam, Bhutan, Arunachal, Upper Assam, Middle Assam, Lower Assam, Bangladesh was done by somebody else. China, of course, was out of this particular work because we weren't able to, logistics or the fund did not allow us to do that. So what we are trying to do is really look at, understand the river and who lives along the river and with the river, and the interconnection between river and the people living along them. In that, we kind of adopt a kind of theoretical framework which talks about gender space. So gender space, as in the gender geographies, are very different. The patriarchal norms are different as you move from one place from the other. So what we try to do here is really looking at there are very many ways in which genderscapes have been understood. But what we were looking at here is the lived in spaces or existential spaces. The other objective of the work was to really connect the natural landscape with the socio-cultural landscape. This is also not new. This idea is not new. It's just that the application is a little different. So the kind of theory that we start is kind of simplistic, but that makes, I think, a lot of sense, that river valleys have a better quality of land. Therefore, they have, I mean, historically speaking, they had higher value of land because the productivity was high. These were also the areas where the labor demand was high. In agriculture, men stayed back, and sometimes other men from other area migrated in. And also the property rights were very well defined, because the moment you have high value of land, property rights actually tend to revolve around that. And it is extremely skewed in favor of men in terms of ownership of land. Now, land, therefore, becomes the key issue through which the patriarchy gets defined. And that, in a sense, the need for men to control the land, as with the water comes along with the land, you can't separate the two. So to actually control the land, you actually evolve a kind of patriarchal system, which is a certain way. Now, in contrast, you have the rugged spaces of the mountainous area from where the river upstream area, which has a less constricting effect on the gender mobility of work, which in the first case, it is very, very constricting, that women can work in whose land, whether it is okay, whether it's society, accepted by the society if the woman works in someone else's land. This also has a caste intersectionality, which makes it complicated. But coming down to the rugged space, it's just the reverse. It's poorly connected, low fertility areas, sparsely populated, lower value of land because of low productivity, and high out migration of men. And therefore, the reason that there is a gender mobility of work is because men have moved out. So women really need to fill up their place to do the agricultural work. So historically, therefore, this kind of a pattern created, this is the theory that we start with, created a patriarchal heartland in the valley region, which is very fertile, and somewhat muted patriarchy in the rugged upland area, which is the upstream area of river. Now, I'm borrowing a little bit of work because I think it's quite exciting to go through this. We have done a gender atlas work long time back, which is of course based on a dated information on census 2011. And we have a district-wise mapping, and I've just cut out, the quality of maps is very poor. So, sorry for that, because cut out the maps from the rest of India. Now, if you look at it, if I can bring it to your notice, that if you look at, say, for example, work participation rates, relative work participation rate, that is female divided by male, you actually see it's much lower in the valley area. It's higher in this is exactly what I was saying, actually. Share of women among cultivators, again, I was talking about that. Here also you can see a lower figure here compared to the upland area. Now, this is something which is percentage of households which are having treated water, sir. Treated water within the premises. There is no earthly reason why the map should be like this, but it is. So it actually follows the same pattern. Slightly, I mean, the differences are slightly less, where in fact, where the water is abundant, those are the districts where these percentages are low. which is again the, area which is fertile and in the valley area. Now this has why this is important, because it has obvious bearing. Anamika has already spoken about that, obvious bearing on the burden of women of their domestic and extra domestic work. So that is kind of strange. And then lastly, again, a policy issue, percentage of government schools with girls' toilet. Again, you see a similar kind of pattern. Again, no earthly reason why it should be this way, but this is coming from water, from land, to water, to something which is completely gendered, because all of us know that if girls' toilets are not there, girl children, particularly after middle school, drop out of school. So basically now I come back to the work which we had done along Brahmaputra, the qualitative work which we had done. And just to make it, summarizing it, that in contrast, the upstream area, Bhutan and Arunachal. Now, Bhutan was favorable because the land ownership actually traditionally were women's ownership. Men did not get the land. So it came from the mothers to the daughters. Those were the areas, therefore, women actually control the land, and therefore they had a very clear idea about the river's ecosystem services. And it was understood by both men and women, but women had very, very clear idea, even though the river was far below the land, because you know how the valleys are in hills. Expanded workspace, which we saw in both Bhutan and Arunachal. Women were all over the place. I'll just show some photographs. And downstream area, actually river was far more looked on as a resource rather than something providing an ecosystem service. Sharper gender division of work, women not in the field, and this cross cut with the kind of culture it came from. So Hindu women and Muslim women were slightly different, but all women were kind of disconnected from monetary transactions of agriculture. However, there is a but in it. And what is that but? And these are the photographs I'm showing you from the upstream area. In spite of the fact I said that, I mean, what I proposed before, the general pattern seems to conform with that, but we see that even in Bhutan, machines can only be used by men, not by women. Here, it's about a double burden, that you see only women working in the field, but it's not as if their household work or burden gets reduced. So it's like a double burden. Thirdly, this is Arunachal Pradesh, and why I took the photograph of these four women, and all these four women are better educated compared to their male counterparts, but all of them reported that they have absolutely no voice in public meetings. So when they have occasion to kind of intervene in the governance, they are not able to do so. Fourthly, this is Apatani tribe, and I just want to point out as the note towards the nose plugs and the tattoos, which were used. I mean, this is the next generation, the daughter who doesn't have it, so it's getting better. But these were used for markers of property. The women were the property, so this was the marker of that. Now, this is one idea of space, which is upstream and downstream. The other idea of space in the river is away from the river and close to the river. This is a second idea of space. Now, what we found is that since Brahmaputra is a river which is almost has an annual event of flood, it's not very easy, even though people are adapted to it. So only the poorest of the poor have stayed back close to the river. And those people who are so I distinguish between communities who are living with the river. So embankment is the marker. So one side of embankment along with the river, and the other side of the embankment, which is mechanical intervention of flood prevention. Now, people who are living along the river have very different views about the river, because for them, flood is not something to get scared of. Primarily, they depend on fishing. So unless it's an extreme kind of a flood, they are happy with the flood because the fish productivity increases. Whereas flood is looked on the people on the other side of the embankment who are landed property rights. I mean, upper caste were landed owners. They are look on the flood as a disaster. So the views are very different. I have a lot more to say, but I don't have time. So basically also the view about the embankment itself is very different therefore. So embankment for the Mishing tribes is not a good thing, not a desirable thing, because it actually increases the volume of the water. Whereas for the others, of course, it's a good thing because it stops the flood. Now, so far as the gender division of work is concerned, this is something in the passing, not very significant, but during the disasters, during the flood, the gender division of work tends to blur when the crisis is actually happening. You see this photograph where both the parents are giving birth to the child, which is not the case usually. But pre the flood and post the flood, again, the gender divide is very, very sharp. Pre the flood, lot of this burden is the women's burden, but post it is qualitatively different. I can't say so. Men go for looking for jobs, and because that had stalled, and women actually are responsible for clearing up the house, which is actually a very tedious task, exposes them to all kinds of infections and all of that. Now, after having said all of this, there are 2 points that I want to raise, that when you are looking at anything with a gender lens, particularly in context of Brahmaputra, there is a danger of pitching. So there are people living along the river, I said, are already very poor. So there's a danger of pitching poor women against poor men, both of whom are very, very disadvantaged. So one should kind of draw a boundary there. And the second thing which overarchingly come out, that irrespective of the upstream, downstream gender context, there's a lack of agency of the women, which is universal, to speak out in the public domain, which is of course not at all there in the downstream. Even in the upstream, they're educated, they are working on their own, they have earning, there's still that universality holds. Now, for transboundary water management, because Anamika was also talking about it, and this entire 2-part study was actually pitched to this. Number one, I don't think the transboundary management has been looked on from the lens of gender, but the gender issues are very similar, say, in Bangladesh and India. And for me, there's a potential solidarity for transboundary water management if you actually enter through the gender lens. The issues are common. We can discuss about that, but that's one point. The second, that again, when you are talking about transboundary river management, flood management cannot be looked on as a unitary and homogeneous issue because different people understand it differently. Third, in context of Brahmaputra, actually, which actually not, it is partly related to climate change, partly related to the mechanical measures. That is what the people believe. Prevention of erosion in the banks and shifting of the river course actually is far homogeneous in terms of the views from the ground. Everybody, almost everyone, looks on that as a greater disaster compared to floods which bother them every year. Now, coming back to this is my last slide, coming back to the conclusions and the theory that we started with. Number one, we do see a kind of a convergence between the natural landscape and the social construct and the gender construct, overarchingly. There are micro evidences which does suggest that in Bhutan and Arunachal, there are slightly diluted gender divide compared to, say, Assam and Bangladesh, particularly Lower Assam and Bangladesh. But the important takeaway from me from this study is that it is far more nuanced than this. It is not just about hard patriarchy and soft patriarchy. It actually talks about the multiplicity of patriarchy, which are very nuanced, which cannot be understood in terms of their respective strengths or weaknesses. It is just that they are qualitatively different. And why I'm saying is because there was this universality, for example, about women not being able to speak up irrespective of where they are. So thank you very much. That is all that I had.
Thank you, Sucharita. Thanks a lot for giving us the insight and getting into the details of what we were seeing, seeing from what Anamika was talking about. It is very much related to what we are talking today as a topic, because you get into the details of it, So you rightly said climate change is at the background, and here is the foreground which I am presenting and telling us the detail. And an interesting part which I picked from your work is actually the gender bias or the gender skewedness of activities is seen more in the other time of disaster, and whereas it gets more gender neutral, because then disaster management becomes at the foray. And an important I think part here will be to really learn from you how these dynamics play both at the level of what we carry as a researcher, what we carry from the ground and bring it to the policy level. Because what are we writing as practitioners, or as ground researchers, that becomes kind of a big responsibility for ourselves also. So, and I think that's a big good takeaway for me particularly. And I'm going to invite Devesh to summarize both of your activities and speeches which you gave today, and also start talking about what kind of questions we are having as youth in this. Apart from that, Devesh is also going to represent all the participants here, and if there are any questions, please put it in the chat box so that Devesh can also craft his questions better for the speakers here, for Anamika and Sucharita. And before that, let me just quickly introduce you to Devesh Balbese, if I'm pronouncing it rightly. He hails from Nepal, and at this moment he is doing his studies at Asian Institute of Technology, which is well known, AIT, and Masters in Water Engineering and Management. And earlier, he was also involved with the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, well-known organization, as IKI mode we call it, as research assistant. So I will put rest of the bio in the chat box and invite Devesh to really take the session from here and engage Anamika and Sucharita in your conversation with them. Welcome, Devesh, and thank you so much for agreeing. Let me tell all the participants here, we have been having extremely difficult situation in getting discussants than getting speakers. And that's a kind of a bizarre situation. But every time we get a discussant, we get very elated that, yay, there is a hope in future generation that they are taking up, these environmental studies. So over to you, Devesh, please take it up from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Manshia. Am I audible? Yes, thank you. It's a really proud moment for me to be along with these two boss ladies as I have written in my Instagram. Dr. Namika has been an amazing person who I have always looked up to, particularly someone who is always interested in water governance. And Dr. Sucharita is a mentor of my mentor. So I worked as a research assistant to Dr. Aditi Mukherjee at ECMOD, and she was Dr. Sucharita was one of her teachers, and she looks up to Dr. Sucharita very highly. So I'm blessed to be among these ladies. So I should have prepared a presentation. It would have been easier to, organize my thoughts and given me a framework to talk about. But, one thing about climate change is, the first thermometer, the first impact of climate change is, you're going to feel it in water itself. So, and then water is very complicated in a sense that there are so many dimensions that are, related to water. So the basic dimension, the access to water. Without water, we cannot survive. Everyone needs drinking water, and that is universal human rights, and every constitution in the world probably has that instilled in it. And then there is disasters to water. Water does not bring all goodness. It also brings disasters. There are going to be droughts, that is extreme scarcity of water for prolonged period. And there's going to be floods, which is bringing a lot of water. And there's issues of water quality, as the population has been rising, we are consuming a lot of water, and we are degrading the quality of water at the same time. So the amount of water that we have, we are already putting a big stress by consuming more than what we should, very inefficiently. And whatever water that's remaining is also deteriorated because of water quality, leaving us, very little amount of water to consume. And there is economy of water. Without water, no economy can sustain water productivity that we say. How much dollar can you produce from water? there are industries that thrives in water. There's tourism that thrive in water. And there is the beautiful cultural and indigenous sides to water. You know, water has always been part of our culture and is ingrained in the indigenous use of water. And it's water is obviously very gendered, as we found from Dr. Sucharita's presentation. And there's this issues of water governance, you know, how we govern water and for whom we are governing water to. And the overarching issue is, you know, as Dr. Anamika rightly said, water does not follow administrative boundaries. These boundaries were created by humans way later. So there is issues of managing water within the administrative boundary of the countries. And there's an issue beyond the administrative boundary where, you know, water flows beyond international borders, transboundary issues that follows. An interesting thing about water is, you know, the word arrival comes from a Latin word, and you know, which simply means people living along the same stream or source of water. So water is a source of competition. Now, add climate change to that complexity. You know, what we are doing is creating a lot of what climate change is basically doing is creating a lot of complexity. So our access to water is diminishing, or at times fluctuating, because you know, the availability of water is becoming very erratic given the science of climate change, the impacts of climate change. The floods, the droughts, disasters, which were already happening before climate change, are becoming more intense. Water quality, again, climate change induced disasters bring a lot of sediments, bring our way of using pesticides and fertilizers. Water quality is being impacted. Now, the way we use water is not very efficient, and you know, the impact on climate change on water will definitely affect our economy. And at the governance level, you know, the water governance is affected eventually by the way we govern, the way, you know, the developing countries deal with climate change, because a lot of these things are not really known. Now I'll bring in Nepal's perspective into this. So Nepal is a very new federal country, you know. So they moved into federal country back in 2015. And it's 5-6 years. The country has been split into 7 provinces, 753 local levels. And this, you know, division of levels and division of jurisdictions took a long time. And water is among the jurisdiction of everyone. So automatically the impact of climate change and adaptation to climate change has to happen at every level. But then the way we have, you know, transmitted knowledge to the local levels, especially after federalism, is pretty hard, because, you know, one, we lack proper plans at local levels, at grassroots level, where the impact is actually being felt. We do not have any governing. We have some governing, adaptation plans, but these are mostly written by donors, by people that almost do not live in the areas, and just given to the people for them to follow, who do not understand the context of what is happening. And you know, the grassroots resilience is really missing. So, you know, in that way, you know, something that is already so multidimensional, and climate change comes in and, you know, affects every facets of it, you know, adds to the complexity of water, which is already very complex. And then you have this the incompetent governance that has to deal with everything. They have not been able to deal with water issues in the first place, and now you add complexity of climate change, they'll have to deal with that. And especially new governments, new jurisdiction that has been that has come in very recent years. And this is where the first impact of climate change is going to be. So, you know, these are the general problems that Nepal is, or the world in general is facing, and we need to be able to connect all these dimensions and think of water not in terms of silos, because all the issues of water are so interconnected. And climate change is, water is central to climate change and central to all the SDGs itself. So, the silo thinking has to go. We have to think of in terms of nexus, what the relations of water with energy, food, climate science, and water in itself cannot be managed in its so this again I bring from my learning of Nepal. So what happens in Nepal is, my father was just here, he would have said it better, but so we have this Ministry of Water and Energy, that deals with water issues. Now the narrative of water has been developed in such a way that water is not seen as for other uses, but all we thought was, since 1950s, when they found out the productivity, the hydropower potential of water resources of Nepal, they thought, well, we have a lot of hydropower potential, we have to generate a lot of energy, and we are going to sell this energy to India, and then we're going to become rich, like how the Arabs became rich by selling their oil. And now the issue was, it was that we put all our eggs in one basket. We did not care about other dimensionality of water that I talked about, and now we are busy distributing licenses for power for demand that cannot be consumed within the country. And unless the geopolitics is improved between India and Nepal, we will struggle to sell electricity. So this is a problem of not thinking water in a very multidimensional way, and thinking water as a very unilateral way, and the consequences is yet to be seen. So so these are just my random ranting of thoughts of ideas that I have so far. Now let me bring back the discussion and put forward a few questions to the speakers, and then we'll carry the discussion from there. So my first question is to Dr. Sucharita. We talk about land ownership as a form of, whoever holds the land holds the decision making, and decision making is ultimately, if you have decision making, you're probably empowered. So let's say a bank comes up with as a government comes up with a solution to say, I'll give you a loan for lower interest if the particular land is owned by a woman, and the area, think of advantages and automatically transfer the land to women. And how long would the decision making process follow after the transfer of land? Or do we, the transfer of land also automatically transfer the decision making, or how does that dynamic work? So maybe we could start with this question, and then I'll talk to Dr. Anamika.
Thank you, Devesh. Thanks a lot. Sucharita, over to you. Please take it up, and then we follow it.
Thanks, Devesh, for the very insightful question. Now I have, what your question brings to my mind is work with Aditi was actually doing on solar pump in Nepal, where, I think you may also have been involved with it, I don't know, but where the government actually gave an incentive for giving solar pumps at probably lower rates. I don't remember the details exactly, if the land was jointly owned or owned by the woman. Now that I think it's a smart kind of policy boost. So in the short run, this is likely to help. There are other examples which I have come across working with ACIR, who are doing, smaller programs in West Bengal, Nepal, and Bangladesh, who encourage women in slightly different ways. So if there are these kind of policy measures, by all means, but your question to how long will this take? Now in South Asia, land market is very sticky. It's not very smooth. So there is a lot of very high transaction costs involved in it. Therefore, there's a lot of bribing which goes into, the land being brought into, there's a lot of Benami land, for example, the land records are not straight. So these problems will be there. But on the face of it, where this is kind of the records are smooth, etc., my view is that in the short run, this would help and provide a much needed impetus, because you can't expect the society to change overnight, even though it's changing over a very, very long time frame. But ultimately, it has to have a demonstration effect, and there has to be a kind of, cyclic relationship between this short-term measure, which leads on to a longer-term, gender divides. So I think, according to me, this would be a smart move. It can be, if it can be incorporated into, a policy measure. And I seriously believe that anything to do with water, land, agriculture, etc., you would see a significant difference, even in terms of productivity, technology use, and all of that, not only from the angle of equity and justice by the women, but also I feel, providing incentive to that group whose work is by and large invisible, meaning there's a lot of work which women tend to do, which is not counted as work. This is going to help that. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Devesh, you please continue.
Yeah, so Dr. Anamika, the usual narrative in our part of the world, particularly the developing part of the world, is the Westerners have made use of all the coals and oils, and they have destroyed the environment. And now when it's our turn to develop, they're talking about climate change and somehow trying to stop us, encumber us from being developed. And you present very well, that there's a possibility of green growth. You do not have to halt development to stop climate change or to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Would you care to explain more about green growth? What kind of infrastructures are we talking about? And, the investments, will the international climate, the mitigation funds, the adaptation funds that we talk about, would they be investing in these infrastructures, that bring growth, as well as has that facet of, adaptation and mitigation ingrained in it?
Interesting question, huh? Anamika.
Thank you, Devesh. I will come to your question, but I cannot restrict myself from speaking what Sucharita mentioned, because I'm equally gendered person, as Sucharita would know. I think one of the most important thing is that when you give this access to land to women, what I think you get is a kind of a bargaining power somewhere at the back of her mind, that there is something that is there in my mind. And as she very rightly mentioned, it has to have a long-term impact. But to begin with, I think it's very important that women possesses resources, because that actually give her a bargaining power in a situation where she needs to open her mouth and speak something. So that's what because I'm not an expert in agriculture and labor, but I think that's something which came to my mind when Sucharita was explaining it to you. Coming to your question, okay, my first answer to this is that we have to remember one thing. Of course, as we have been always taking a stand, India has always taken actually a dual stand. One is that per capita emission is very low. And so we are supposed to be, we are not somebody who are making any contribution. So we should not be asked to sign any international document where we are forced to or bind to bring emissions down. That has been the stand. And the second stand has been that, if you look at India's, so India also portrays itself to be a economy developing, but much better than several other developing economies. So that means we do have the resources. That's the kind of a thing that we are portraying outside, that we do have the resources to take care of ourselves. So we are self-sufficient. That also is a kind of an identity we have. So we always had this dual personality when we are, sitting in a negotiation table in related to IPCC, related to a Paris Agreement or the Glasgow, whatever is happening. The point that I want to make here is that irrespective of what has happened in the past, irrespective of what India's contribution has been, one thing is clear is that we will face the blunt more than anybody else. And I think that's very important for us to understand right now. And when you ask me what kind of changes we are talking about, and if you remember, we had a session yesterday, and one thing that I will take from that session is that Anjal gave this example, one of our colleagues, is that Hyderabad now is constructing houses which are full of glass, So what kind of a development is this? This is not green development, right? You don't really have to focus on reducing coal consumption immediately, but you can definitely think of what kind of infrastructure I want to build. Are these infrastructure going to be more energy intensive? Why would it cost you more? It will not. You make it an infrastructure where you don't have to run your air conditioner all the time. That itself is a big contribution, And that will have an impact on your coal production because you would not then demand so much energy, because on the other hand, you're reducing. So demand side is very important. And the other thing is that that is what this time the IPCC report, again, if you look at this, one of the chapters, it has a full-fledged chapter, not only from the point of view of coal and all of these things. The mitigation chapter also had a demand side chapter where they're asking you to reduce demand as an individual, as an organization, as a business enterprise. Everybody should try to reduce the demand. The moment you reduce the demand, it would obviously have an impact on your burning of coal, right? So that is something very important. So Western world is on one end, and coming to funding, absolutely. There has been a lack of funding. This has been raised by several climate activists, but we also have to keep in mind that whatever is the situation, as a country, we have to work together now, and maybe the South Asian countries as a whole, for two reasons. One is to reduce the impact, and on the other, to put our foot down and say that these are the things that South Asia would require if we want to go to the path of mitigation. I'll stop here. I'll take further questions from you.
Just a small thing adding here, Anamika very well put that it's not about just reducing the energy consumption here. We can at individual level also start really changing the demand pattern which is there. And that also brings me to the point of SDG 12, which is the least talked about, responsible consumption and production. So there is no fun, there is no talking, because if we are talking about economic development, sorry to get into it, but I could not also control myself here because I was just giving lecture on this to TIS Mumbai. On very much that how SDG 12 is the mother of really solving many problems which we are facing in climate change. Over to you, Devesh. Please take it further.
Thank you, Dr. Mansi. So when you talk about regional cooperation, as a South Asian, as a South Asian staying in Southeast Asian, I look at these Southeast Asian countries and, ASEAN, which is very strong and very vocal and very proactive in talking about regional issues, coming together and talking of, common problems such as climate change, meeting very often, being very technical, finding solutions. You have this Mekong River Commission that, very proactively meets and talks about downstream transboundary issues. In case of South Asia, is this something that we are lacking? Is SAARC defunct? Do we need another organization to bring in regional cooperation? Or, what could be the right solution to bring the South Asian regional to the paramount importance? The answer, the question is to both of you. Please take turns.
Anamika, you would like to take it? Or who, Sucharita, would you like to go
no,
first?
I will kind of answer later from the lens of, again, Brahmaputra, but
okay.
Let
Anamika.
Little more general.
A very straightforward and simple answer. Political will. Yes. Doesn't matter what organization you build, whatever exists, if there is a political will, every organization would function. Here, one thing I want to say, we should actually look at climate change as an opportunity here. Because if you really look at the kind of stress that climate change is posing, it is important that countries work together. Today, if we really want to shift from coal, we need different source of energy. So which means we need hydropower as one very important source of energy. One of the reasons is a lot of problem, apart from the local concern, there are also transboundary concerns. Like for example, Nepal and India. It is important that Nepal agrees to India's demand to build hydropower dams. How do you do it? That is where I think it should be taken as a climate change, should be taken as an opportunity to actually bring countries together and be able to fulfill the pledges that each country has made in these different climate agreements. Otherwise, there is just no way out. So my answer is we definitely don't need any other regional arrangement. The existing regional arrangement can really work well, but what is really required is the political will, political commitment, and also political awareness. I think there's a lot of lack of awareness, even at the political level, to understand where we are heading to and how serious this matter is, the climate change that we are talking about. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. We are actually talking already to some politicians to come and talk up with us about water matters. So hopefully they will come on board sometime very soon. Over to you, Sucharita.
Yeah. So the thing is, the geopolitics is a very, very complicated issue. So there is a tussle between economic power, the kind of powers that you align with. So it cannot be answered in a very simple way. But I think in the long run, no matter what we say, people are not going to, decisions are not made by us. But however, I touched upon this point, but I don't want to go into that specific point. We have to look at, areas of mutual interest and flag those. Keep on, our duty as activists or academicians would be constantly flagging, research-based flagging of those issues where countries could come together. So to give you an example, taking Brahmaputra as an example, is that if India, so in this I find it very interesting that when we spoke about, I was engaging with the transboundary thing, that you actually have economic powers superimposed on the physicality of the river. So, for example, the upstream areas can do whatever and get away with it and do not get impacted by whatever the downstream countries are doing, right? So if you suppose build a, say, dam or something, restrict the water, that is going to impact the downstream countries. But irrespective of whatever the downstream countries are doing, that will not impact the upstream country. So in this particular case, you have China, India, say take China, India, and Bangladesh. The economic power are actually organized in the same order, and the physicality superimposes on that. Instead of this, China we can't do anything about, but India is a lower reach country, and it should be able to understand what Bangladesh is facing like it is facing the consequences of what China is doing. So there are things like, I think our effort should be in any kind of even climate change collaborations should be to, I think Anamika rightly pointed out, COVID comes to my mind immediately because that is also, people have linked that with climate change in one way or the other. How important, say, for example, this entire effort of vaccination, which we did not do it properly at all, but how important the collaboration became as an after effect of the, initiation point was the climate change thing. But the cooperation is required, and sooner, I think this is a great example where we understand that if the infection is there in some country, it is going to again hit back the other countries. So unless you cooperate, climate change is exactly the same, and it is the initiation point which will have multitude of impacts. So many impacts that we can't even begin to understand all of that. And therefore, it's kind of unjust in a way, because if you look at the temporality of the development trajectory, the so-called global north has got away by emitting a lot of seas, and we are facing the brunt of that. And now that we have reached a certain stage of development, we are asked that, okay, now it is a global thing, it's a global village, and everybody should pitch in. So that's unjust, but we do not have a way out of this. In spite of the unjust framework, I think one has to think about ways of cooperation.
Yeah, thank you, Sucharita, and thanks, Anamika. And I will also thank Devesh to invite actually participants now to get on board to ask questions with all the speakers, all three of you for that matter. But just to add a line here, what Sucharita said, and then open it up to participants. We already have one question in the chat box. So both of you can start looking at it. And what Sucharita was mentioning, that if we really don't do it, we don't have choice. A good choice can be that actually we leapfrog what the developed countries did. Why do we have to go through the full cycle of mistake and then reach there? And that is, I think, Anamika also made it very clear. And we can leapfrog with using our traditional wisdoms. We have all the tools to really do. One of the most community strengths which we have really seen in water management right from the past, and good flood is an example of that. How people have looked at it very differently than the developed nations have looked at. So I will invite one of our wiki president from Manipur, Dr. Rajkumari Devi, to really open up the question and answer from the participants. We have your question on the chat box, but it will be good if you speak directly with the speakers. It makes it more human. Dr. Rajkumari.
Hi everybody. Yeah, nice
Hi.
to meet you, Mansi. Yeah, so it's a great discussion. Actually, my question is not directly, but indirectly, since coming to the point of discussion, can there be any tangible, solution for climate-induced water stress, like being Manipur being topographically a valley and a hilly area? It's more like Nepal, but we have the plan about 10% valley area. So right now we have quite a good number of rainfall during monsoon, but runoff is too high. Again, it comes to the point where water conservation is less. But it's not just, my question is not just focused to Dr. Anamika or Dr. I can't get the name. Sorry. Yeah. So but maybe, sorry. Yeah. I don't have my glasses on. So anyway, so maybe in the future discussion, if anybody can come up with any more solution, like a short term or long term. Long term, yeah, we always go for forestation in the upper east or horticulture, plantation, and so on. But again, coming to the short term, if any other, success stories which can be, repeated here in Manipur. So again, I have heard about the Brahmaputra issue, or maybe about the Majuli Island problems, but it's a little different from that. Being, we have the hilly, this hilly area. Most of the settlement are on top of the hill, and the river flows down. So the source of water, the river, is quite away from the settlement area. So being a warrior, lifestyle inhabitants, they're away from the source of water, and now that has become the main problem. So I just want to know where this kind of problem or issues are anywhere in your work, where you can come up with a solution, or let's say a term policy or anything.
Thank you, Rajkumari. Sucharita, I will invite you to take that question.
Yeah, so that was an interesting thing. I have worked for a very long time on a particular program which comes to my mind when you are asking about solutions for Manipur, which has both the hills and the plains, which is something that we have, and we have not paid enough attention to it, which is the watershed program, actually.
Yeah.
That's the only program that I can think of which actually brings together the physical and the social and the economic. So it bridges environmental management with productivity, as also a poverty reduction, even though there are inbuilt inequalities within watershed management programs, because technically it is, if the government money is going into it, if you own more land, you are likely to be more benefited. So there there were provisions in the program where focus was to be given to the common property resources and
Okay.
use local labor in whatever kind of bunding work.
Yeah. In that sense,
And all of
that is exactly
Yeah.
what we are doing right now. My work is like watershed management. So I was thinking, okay. If that be the case,
I think there are problems in it, but I think we should pay much more focus to it. And in India, at least about, Manipur is not even in the, focal area of watershed development program and the resource allocation. Much of the resources actually come to the semi-arid tropics in India.
exactly.
So I think that should be the mechanism.
Geopolitics, geopolitics or political
That is always.
So that has to be corrected. And you are absolutely right that all mountainous area, particularly those which have adjacent plain area, actually really require this, because the erosion has not only an impact on the hills, but the adjacent plain area, because the deposits actually come and plug up all the channels and therefore reduce capacity of the channels, irrigation, drinking water, whatever it is. So I think it's as important in the plains as in the hills. So one departure from the way the program is going to kind of change the resource allocation more towards the hills. The second is that it is currently geared towards undulating plateau region. So it should be also the plains which need it equally. So these are the two directions which I would say.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajkumari and Sucharita. So for the next few questions, I request both the speakers and also Devesh to really look at the chat box and start answering so we save time. So over to you, Anamika. You have already volunteered for the question, and there is next question for Sucharita also. So thanks, Vishal, for the understanding. So we will just start answering them. Okay, Anamika, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Vishal, and good to see you here. What I feel is you have definitely made a very valid point about adaptation and mitigation. So far it has been adaptation versus mitigation. And let me also put it a little bit from an economics point of view. When you talk about mitigation, the biggest concern is the discount rate that you're going to choose, in the sense that what I'm investing today, what is the worth of that investment, which is going to come to me some 50 years down the line, I'm not going to see that effect of that investment today. That always been an issue, and therefore developing countries never really wanted to invest much on mitigation. And so in Kyoto Protocol, several strategies came out, like we have this CDM projects, we have the joint implementation. So the idea is that we don't invest, developing country do not invest, the developed world comes to your country, make an investment, gets a credit, and then they can pollute in their country, which is overall what we want to say is that you have a cap and you do not cross that cap, irrespective of where you are investing and reducing the GHG emission. We don't have so much time, I'm not going to go into detail, but why I brought this up is because that was the time when adaptation started to take place, because we could see that a lot of changes are happening, a lot of climate impacts are happening, and people need to survive. And so they have to adapt to the situation. But Vishal, I'm sure you'll agree with me on this. If you really look at the kind of adaptation that is happening, are they really adaptation? They are not actually. They're still coping strategies. These are not transformative adaptation. What I mean to say is that this adaptation doesn't bring you or put you in a better position than where you were earlier before the impact happened. It in fact puts you in a worse situation than where you were. So I think what we are missing out here is that in developing countries are neither investing well in adaptation, nor they are willing to invest in mitigation, and we are spending a lot of money in the name of adaptation, which are not real adaptation, which are not really bringing benefit to the community. So I think it is very important now for the developing countries to really understand two things. One, redefine the adaptation strategies. Try and understand what actually you mean by adaptation. It is not coping. In simple language, it means before the impact, I was here. After the impact, either I'm here or I'm better than here. I cannot go down. And the second thing is, while you will continue adapting, your adaptation will become maladaptation beyond a point, because you cannot continuously adapt. Now, I just give you the example of what's happening in Hyderabad, that, we need buildings, we need infrastructure. Well, it is getting very warm, we have to adapt. How are you adapting? Installing more air condition. That is also an adaptation. We're adapting to the change in climate, but that is maladaptation. So if you do not focus on mitigation, your adaptation cost will be very, very high, and you cannot really withstand the impact of climate change. So simple point, adaptation and mitigation are not substitutes, nor something which versus this. It has to go hand in hand, complementary, particularly for countries like India, because I think we can manage to ensure that much of resources to invest on mitigation. We can always debate again, Vishal, but this is my answer to you for now.
Thank you. But very well put. You were also talking about it during your speech as well, that it is a development discourse which has to take them along and not one or the other. So Sucharita, I invite you to take the next question from Vishal. So thanks again, Vishal, for putting questions. Yeah. And just to let you know, both of you, Vishal has been our regular participant. So it enlightens, when he's sitting around, something is going around. Okay.
I think he's a friend to both of us.
Yes, all of us.
So Vishal has two questions. The first, to answer the first one, the kind of gender issues I have in mind is I think there is a commonality in terms of the gender issue and the river in different countries. So particularly from whatever our study reflects, we have not done China, but certainly India and Bangladesh, and Lower Assam and Bangladesh, very, very similar. So what I had in mind is that instead of looking at the entire transboundary issue as your water, my dam, I will restrict water, I will generate this, and I don't care what is happening down below, and constant engagement at a very high level. So the first point is actually not even gender, that you will, I don't know how this can be, probably it's asking for the sky, but in an effective transboundary water management system, you will have to have people's voices in it. And they have to, I mean, there are different kind of institutional models which are successful in some places, in fact, some countries, where you actually have an institutional setup to get the voices to actually built into the shape and form of the direction of the transboundary water management governance. And here, what I had in mind, that if you have common problems, say, for example, you have women's group on both sides, they work together, then it is actually, there are more chances of collaboration, cooperation, rather than, like delineating water, this much water, this much of water, what are the discharge and things like that. You move away from that and kind of rally around similar points of problems which are affecting people, which is not the model as of now at all. I agree, but that's why I was saying, not only through a gender lens, but through the lens of the people whose life gets impacted, who live along the river. They are not the ones who are deciding at all. So when we were doing our field work, many of them were not even aware of the current changes which were being made to the river. They had absolutely no clue. So forget about their being in the decision-making position. They were not even, the information was not available to them is what is going to happen to the river. Whether it is dredging, whether it is stopping water. Sometimes some people who are more educated would read it in the papers and would kind of add 2 and 2 together. But this is something, that's the kind of thing which I had in mind. And the second question about multiple patriarchy. So that is, I'm coming from a perspective of gender geography, where there are spaces that contain patriarchal norms, gender relations, and performances and portrayals of men and women in their everyday life. And this tend to be very, very different in different. So for example, we say Hindi heartland, the kind of patriarchal space that you have there compared to say Kerala. Kerala is not generic and not homogeneous, but by and large, the difference will offset the kind of patriarchal norms you have there. So these would be elements of multiple patriarchies. So therefore, I like to use the term patriarchies and not patriarchy, but complicated. So therefore, what I was trying to present is that there is a kind of relationship between the physicality of the river and the patriarchies which are along the river. But at the same time, I said that there are certain universalities which are universal across the board in terms of, say, the what I mentioned in this talk, but there are other things that public speaking is not allowed. Women cannot participate effectively in, say, governance of the river, that local governance also. So there is this multiple patriarchy superimposed on that. There is a universality, and therefore you really, that intersects with each other and produces something which is quite complex, which that is what I was trying to say, that it is just not hard or soft patriarchy, but it is qualitatively different patriarchies. So one offshoot of that would be the example I gave of more progressive gender workspace in, say, Zero Valley, but women being double and triple birth there. So there is no one way that you can look at it. That is what I meant.
Thank you, Sucharita. We will take last question because we have already crossed the time, and then I have to do announcement for next sessions. So Sabina has a question for, I think, Anamika, you have partly answered, but maybe if you like to add something to that question, you may take it. Given groundwater is the biggest portion of drinking water, how can South Asia be prepared, possibly as preventive measure, if not in mitigative measures?
I'm not very clear about the question, but what I understood is that that can groundwater act as a, if you are there, Sabina, maybe you can unmute and ask the question.
That's a good idea. Sabina, would you like to elaborate or clarify, to have the discussion, or?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
For such a wonderful presentation. So just to clarify, the groundwater is very much vulnerable to climate change. And that's what I was referring to, given that how are we going to be prepared to make us prepared for, to mitigate any impact on groundwater in our region. So that was my question, if I'm clear.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sabina. Anamika? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, yes, it is true. Of course, it actually more than groundwater, surface water is even more, exposed to climate change. But it is no doubt that groundwater is a major source of drinking water in most of the South Asian countries. But it is also very important that we call about conjunctive use of both, ground and the surface water. So one way is obviously we really need to now look at those surface water which can be used for drinking purposes. However, the problem is, and this is something I want to make it very quickly clear, Mansi, with why India or any other South Asian countries uses more groundwater compared to surface water, because of the quality issue. Groundwaters are not so exposed. If you have arsenic problem, etc., is another matter. But otherwise, groundwater is not so exposed. You don't really need such kind of a filtration method. If you have a tube well in your house, you bring it out, you just have a small RO system and you drink. But if you are thinking of sourcing water from Brahmaputra, you have to clean it a lot. So there's a lot of treatment required. So it's always easier to go for a groundwater source compared to the surface water. But given this situation, Sabina, what I would say is that drinking water is a challenge. But if you also have to remember, it's a very small portion of the total amount of water that we use in terms of agriculture and industry. I really like one point that Devesh made, and which we all have not actually focused on, is the water efficiency. I think that's the most important thing. If we really want to reduce water stress, water use efficiency is extremely important in South Asia, be it domestic, be it agriculture, be it industry. If you can solve that, improve water use efficiency, I think we can actually, reduce a lot of stress. I hope I have been able to answer your question. Mansi, I know we are running out of time, but one small intervention about what Vishal mentioned. Vishal, I want to tell you one very important thing related to your question to Sucharita, how gender issues are flagged in transboundary. For example, Sucharita in her case showed that how women suffers in most of the cases. Let me tell you, when there is no data sharing between two countries, when disaster happens, the one who suffers the most, it's women. when there is no proper, access to water because of the transboundary issues, it is women. However, if you really look at all the transboundary discourses, the transboundary international law, women doesn't figure out anywhere. Entirely, it's a gender neutral document. Gender neutral, I would say, because it doesn't even consider, when you are asking about participatory approach, whom are you asking to participate? When you are trying to tell that, okay, we are constructing a dam, who is coming here and participating? Let me tell you, in Arunachal, when I spoke to a woman, she told me that I want the dam to be there because it will solve a lot of my problem. At least there'll be electricity and I will not have to work at late night in dark. So you can see there are varied views about so many things, but these views never come at the transboundary discourse. Women is considered to be at the domestic front, and domestic water is personal. Women at transboundary doesn't come because transboundary is a public space. And so you don't want women to be representing there. And that's very quick answer to Vishal's question.
But very well put, Anamika, because we also have to talk about Wiki and Water Resource Council, where we are talking about women leadership and bringing voice there. And I think these things will be also raised more when we are all coming together and really amplifying this very aspect. Just to remind all of you that actually we had Professor Bitopi Datta from TIS Guwahati, and she actually detailed out what kind of vulnerabilities women go through, and she gave a case study of Brahmaputra floods. So even details to the scale of pregnancy and menstruation, which do not, I mean, when you get into the grains, but we are not discussing grains today, but we tried today to cover from the global policies to the local impact through Anamika's journey, to Sucharita's journey, and then Devesh brought the transboundary journey also here. And these conversations can really go on and on. We love to do that because we all are, like to talk about water because we are also concerned about it. It's not about liking only, but also we are trying to do little bit, as Sucharita rightly mentioned also in her talk, that we have to do our bit, especially and it is one of the rare moments when we saw 3-generation academia. And I'm saying it 3-generation because it's Devesh to Anamika to Sucharita, so knowledge is also flowing and trickling, and we are also hoping that it is also expanding, because I don't recall from my time there were many water scholars, but today we really have more water scholars talking about it in those lines. So that brings an end to the conversation today. I like to thank again Sucharita, Anamika, and Devesh for really finding out time. It's always wonderful to listen to various case studies and also get intersection about the scales here. And we would like to also remind our participants about our ongoing painting competition to really get students engaged, adults engaged, anybody can get into it. And we have wonderful e-vouchers to also flag what kind of thoughts you have about water. It can be water wisdom, water celebration, water concerns. You can put your thoughts into pen and pencil or colors. We will invite that. And last year also we had that to celebrate. So today, this time we are also announcing, because we are also going to celebrate it to complete our 1 year. Next session on 13th of April, we have another powerhouse presentation and with the speakers. Let me also give you that little glimpse. We are going to talk about interlinking of rivers, the case of 2 links, Partapi Narmada versus Ken Betwa, and who else can better talk? Any guess? We have Himanshu Thakkar coming next week, and we are very excited, and he will be accompanied by 2 more speakers. We are still looking for it because we had some alterations, so some changes there. So if anybody wants to really suggest us something, we are open about it. We also have some reserves, but we would really look for more speakers for the next session. But Himanshu sir has already confirmed, so we are very excited. We look forward to having you next Wednesday and the next Wednesday when we complete 1 year, and the Wednesdays to come, because Wednesdays for Water 2 season is more packed with water movies, water club, PhD platform, and whatnot. And also the Wiki women leaders are also going to tell their stories. So that's also part season 2. So we thank again all the participants to make Wednesdays for Water meaningful and continuously encouraging us to really keep doing it, because doing every week, you may agree with me, is not easy. You know, it's extremely difficult. We plan things ahead of time, but we have to thank all the speakers who have been generous and also appreciating and encouraging us to keep doing it. So thank you all the speakers, Namika, Sucharita, and Devesh, and thanks all the participants for joining us. Do join us and keep talking about water and try to do your bit to solve it. Thank you so much. Namaskar, and please take care of yourself.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Please take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, you